Okay, so somebody asked me about outlining study tips, and I figured now's a good time to discuss that stuff since, people are going to be getting into exam time soon, and this is the time when people are going to be outlining, and hopefully people have been outlining throughout the semester. But I'm happy to share my tips now and maybe give you some pointers, things you can change up. And for those of you who haven't started outlining, this should give you a good basis for the study methods that I used and the way I constructed my outline in the first place. So, just a few tips, starting with outlining. And just in general, I know it's a little bit late in the semester, but you want to try and outline consistently. This relates back to just always being prioritized throughout the semester and having time at the end to do practice exams. You don't want to be doing practice exams during the exam study period. That's when you want to be getting ready for the exam and actually taking practice tests. So you want to outline consistently. And usually, I would outline when you get finish some discrete chunk of the class. Say, you spend a week on the tort of battery. At the end of that week, might as well outline it and summarize it. It will refresh your mind about everything you just learned. It will make sure that it'll help you make sure that you understand all the points. It will help highlight the areas in which you need help, so you know that those are things you should take to the professor and discuss in your study group. So outline consistently, whenever you reach certain checkpoints in the class. I would start by getting old outlines from past students. This will give you a template of something you can look to and say, okay, here's what an outline ideally looks like when it's completed. It's better when you get multiple outlines from the same class because then you can look at different styles, you can compare them, and the more data points you have, the easier it is to fill in all the holes and make sure you have all the information. And it's just comforting to have something there on the page because when you're just looking at your own blank page of an outline when you start, it's hard to say, okay, what am I supposed to do here? So get some past outlines, take a look at what other students did. Especially if you know the student did well, then you know that his information is right on topic of what you're supposed to be going for. So definitely get your hands on some old outlines. With regard to how I structured my own outline, nothing out of the ordinary. I would start with some overarching topic. I put a heading for, as I said, just relating back the tort of battery, or one of the federal rules, say, class actions or something about personal jurisdiction, not a federal rule, but an important doctrine in civil procedure. So you just put the main heading up of what you want to talk about. And then I would run through typically the top section right after my heading would be all the pertinent rules or statutes. So if this was CivPro, and I would say, okay, I'm talking about class actions, and I would run through all the specific federal rules of civil procedure and the sub rules that would apply to class actions, because I just wanted some reference right there at the top of the page for here's the applicable rules. If you're going to be talking about class actions, you're going to be calling out these rules, and you don't want to accidentally say the wrong rules. You want to know exactly which one is which, and it's good to just have those being the first thing, just the statutory rules right there up at the top. And certain classes aren't going to have statutes that you can really just list out there at the beginning, but I would put the rules and the doctrines and the key things from that particular area of the class. Say you're working on offer and acceptance and contracts. I would put all the rules, something like if so and so happen, an offer is effective if so and so happens. Some kind of, not necessarily as much black letter law as you can get onto the outline, things that you have to remember. The mailbox rule, something like that. You want to know what the doctrine is, and just to have it there, sort of in a bullet pointed format. Now, within each rule and for each piece of black letter law, I would like to write underneath it, of course, put the exceptions to it, so that in your discussion, and of course, when you're talking about the rule, maybe you want to mention the exception. Maybe it creates some kind of fork, a way to flesh out the arguments, or maybe one party's going to focus on the rule, the other party's going to say no, it falls into the exception. So it's good to have always counterpoint the rules with the exceptions to the rules. And here's an important thing, probably the most important thing in my outline. And it's not something that a lot of people do. A lot of outlines just have the black letter law. But remember, you're not just learning the law and then spewing it back. You're applying the law in the exam. So what I would do is maybe put an example or two for each doctrine. I would say, okay, Here's an example of a situation that would fall within it. Here's an example of something that probably would not. Just so just plot some data points in my head and say, here's what the boundary of this doctrine really is. Because on the exam, they're not going to say, what is, what would constitute acceptance. They're going to say, here's a situation, so and so did this, and X did that, Y did this, and you're going to have to say, well, it's the acceptance of an offer, but you're going to have to run through the facts of this particular situation. So what I like to do in my outline, knowing that this is going to be the case in the exam, is to say, okay, this is a situation in which it probably would be acceptance. Here's one in which it probably would not be an acceptance. That way, I just have some data, as I said, some data points in my head, and I have a feeling for what's sort of pushes the boundary and what doesn't. And my outlines were longer than a lot of other students because I would end up putting so many of these little examples. After each thing, I would just put 2 quick examples and 2 quick lines. It just really helped in my studying to just be, pointing out these hypotheticals. As I said, the best studying is all about applying the law that you learned, not just reciting back what it is. Of course, memorizing the doctrine itself is important, but the more important thing is learning to apply that doctrine to factual situations. So if you can work that into your outline, some kind of application, it can never hurt, because then you run back through these examples, 2 months after you write them, and you say, oh yeah, it refreshes your mind really well in a factual application sense. And then underneath, the doctrine, the black letter law, I would put the applicable cases as they relate to the different doctrines. If in offer and acceptance we had 3 cases that were very important, I would put those down there just so I remember what they are. Some professors want you to cite cases on the exam. Some don't want you to mention them at all or don't really require it. You really need to, confer with your professor, find out about that, because the more specific they want you to be about cases, the more specific you're going to be in your outline. So, of course, you're going to have some case information, even if it's a class that doesn't really focus too much on cases. I would still get the important ones down there, just because they give you the overarching factual situations from those cases that you can use, for application purposes. And then underneath the cases, I would put some kind of miscellaneous notes. This is just the catch-all for things that aren't necessarily black letter rules, or it's not a case, it's not a statute in itself, and it's not an example. But it's just something that I felt like, oh, look for this on the exam, or if you see this, be suspicious of this. Just notes to myself, because the outline, at the end of the day, it's just a way of studying. And so what we just went over was just sort of the structure of how I would put my outline together. There's some other points I wanted to discuss about outlines in particular. So, again, what I was just saying is, outlining is studying. It's not just preparing something that you're going to use later. Outlining the process is the most important thing. The document itself and what you create from it is really almost irrelevant. I would say that the classes I knew the best, I learned so much through outlining. On the day of the test, I didn't need that document there anymore. I could have thrown it out the door before I went into the exam. It was already in my head. I'd memorized all the law. I'd done so much practice of application. It was really just, it was just a paperweight to me. I was, comforted to have it with me, but I never really used it. So good outlining is studying, and it's constructive, productive studying, because you're really running through and applying and summarizing all the law that you have and synthesizing all the pieces into this large collective whole. And if you can take this massive notes and scribblings in your book and taking information from other outlines and really concisely put it into your own, the stuff, and you're not going to need to actually, and you're not going to have time to look through it on the exam itself. So never rely on an outline as some real big resource during an exam. It's really not going to be a resource during the exam. It's the process of making it that makes it important. Also, sources of information of when you're making this outline. What I would do is I would sort of lay out on a table my notes for the class, my book, which had lots of highlighting and notes in the margins, and also maybe 1 or 2 outlines from past students. That way I can go from summarizing my notes, adding in whatever things in the margins that I thought were helpful from cases, and then also adding in information, just filling in the holes with information from other outlines that I say, oh, maybe it's good to have that piece of information, or, he put a good example in his outline that I think would, is a good counterpoint to my example. I'll put that in there too. So it's good to have multiple places to look because no one source is going to have all the information you need. Your notes will inevitably, have some holes. The other outlines from the other students are, they're not going to say it in ways that necessarily make it clear to you. So just put everything together from all the different sources. I didn't just make one large outline for my classes because, as I said, a large outline, you're not going to have time to be flipping through, a 50-page document to find some one little thing. You're not going to be using it that much on the exam. But what I would make is a summarized version of the outline, almost like a checklist. And this would maybe be 2 or 3 pages. But it would be a checklist of things that sort of covered all the main topics and the elements of all the major. Let's say in torts, I wanted to have something right in front of me, just a page saying the elements of all the major torts, things that you should know, but you never want to forget, just in case. Can't hurt to have this kind of checklist of major concepts. That I would actually use on the exam because it's easy to you hit causation on the exam, and let's say there's 5 or 6 main points that I know I want to hit every time I do a causation question, and I know it because I've done practice exams and I know what the professor wants in her answers. So I would summarize those main points and use that on the exam. I would say, okay, causation question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Those are the things I want to hit when I go into this question. And that takes all of 10 seconds to look to, as opposed to looking through 10 pages of it in your actual outline. That you're not going to do. Certain classes that are based on rules, say, the biggest example, civil procedure. Also you have in torts, you'll have restatement provisions. I'll discuss what that is maybe in another video. But in any class in which you have a lot of rules that you would like to keep in your mind, say in contracts you have a lot of UCC provisions, I would make a chart of all the rules. And I know I said I put it into my outline, but at the same time I don't want to be flipping through that big document to look for individual rule provisions in different sections. I would just make a chart of all the rules essentially in number order. For something like the civil procedure class, you take the federal rules, and I would just make a chart of all the rules, and then put sort of right next to the rule, of course, write what the rule is, what's the case that sort of correlates with that rule, and that way, if I'm running through it, I know exactly what the rule is, what all the related rules are, what the relevant cases were. And they were just sort of on a landscape kind of chart, and I felt like it was a really neat way of organizing everything. In certain classes, again, if cases are very important to your professor, maybe you want to do that also for the cases that you learn. Just make a sort of a chronological list of all your cases that you went over the course of the semester. Maybe you can just put the case name and then just next to it the rule from that case, something really brief and short. Again, there are certain classes in which I would bring in all these documents, the capsule outline, that summarized outline, the case chart, a rule chart. You're not necessarily going to use all these things, but for the one rule that that slips your mind which sub-rule you're talking about, you look it up. You don't want to lose a point for any reason, so just cover all your bases. So that's all about outlining. I just wanted to do maybe a minute or